All right, so today we're going to talk about just prepping your plate for the purpose of Linocut and block relief printing. So unlike the etching process that we did before spring break, you don't have to do much to prep your plate. You can take this plate just as is and start carving into it. If you want to freehand carve into it, you can draw on it and then carve into it. You can draw and then transfer onto it, but you don't really have to do much to this plate to start the process. But I will show you some things that you can do if you're interested. The first thing you can do is taking a sheet of sandpaper, so 400 grit or higher, not the strong stuff or the really coarse stuff, just something a little bit coarser than, or a little bit finer than what you would find in the standard store. And so all we're doing is helping release some of the chemicals or finishers that they might have put on this linoleum before they sold it to you. So I have an 800 grit sandpaper, and you really don't have to do this. This is an optional thing, and a lot of these things for prepping the plate are optional. But I just wanted to give you the best version of this. So I'm just taking my 800 grit and I'm just sanding it. And all I'm trying to do, and I'm not sure that you can see it, but there's little bitty like levels to this thing. So there's some hills, there's some valleys. In your primary printing or inking process, these won't really show up, but if you want to know how you would, this is how you would. So because the 800 or 600 or higher are usually finishers rather than sandpaper that changes the material. This is just refining the material. And so again, I'm just going in a circular motion, but if you're really worried about it, you can go into one direction rather than going in a circular motion. But again, it's a finishing sandpaper, so it's not really changing the material, it's just helping the material. And the reason we might choose to do this is because that finisher or whatever they might have put on it before it was sold to you, when it was in the warehouse, all of those things, oils of people's fingers, etc. Like all that stuff could have happened to this plate. And by removing that little final finish or that protective surface, we actually open up the porosity of this linoleum to take ink a little bit better. Again, when you're printing, even if you're printing at home, this step is not necessary. But if you find yourself wanting really clear ink coverage while using a limited amount of ink, it is nice to make sure that it's all even and flat, that it's ready to accept ink. Again, very optional, but that's what you could do. So I just used that 800 grit to open it up. And then I could finish off cleaning this using some denatured alcohol, or if you just have regular isopropyl alcohol and things like that. After I've sanded a little bit, I'm just gonna give it a slight wipe with a little bit of a damp paper towel. I'm not gonna introduce too many chemicals into it right now. So that's step one, again, as an option. The other thing that you can do is that you'll find that when you carve these plates, the gray of the top of the linoleum and the gray of the inside of the linoleum. So after you've made your first mark, I'm just gonna make a quick one here. So you can probably see this, but it's a little bit darker on the outer skin than it is on the inside skin. So sometimes it's very helpful, but sometimes it's not helpful enough. So thinking about if you have a bunch of these marks that you need to carve over and over, that little gray might not be enough to differentiate if you've carved deep enough or not. So one thing that we can do is we can just give this a coating of acrylic ink, or we can also just use a marker to color in the plate. So I'm just using a marker. I'm coloring in that plate just a little bit. Then I'll give it a wipe down to make sure it's dry. And now there's a glaring difference between it being carved there we go. So we can see that difference. So the downside to using this method is that first, it wastes a lot of your marker to color this whole thing. That'd be a long time. And then secondly, usually when you're printing this, whatever ink you're using, so here's just a Speedball water soluble block printing ink, whatever ink you're using will reactivate the agents in here, and then this color will also transfer with the first print. If that's the case, I mean, most likely it will be the case, before you print, you'll need to wipe off this color. So taking simple green, or if you need to use more caustic things, you can, but simple green or any of your household cleaners should take off that first layer of color so that it won't print. If you find yourself not having access to those cleaners and the ability to remove this, you can accept that the first few prints will have an added color of whatever marker choice you chose. So being preemptively, you can choose to make the color similar to whatever color you're choosing to print. So if I chose to use magenta or red marker instead of a blue marker, then when the first ones print, it won't be so noticeable. Again, it is just an optional way of treating your plate if this isn't enough for you. Lastly, what you can do is after you've colored it in, you can take some shellac, and I'm not gonna do that example there because this particular shellac takes about 24 hours. If you mix it with denatured alcohol, you can shorten that time. I do have shellac and alcohol mix, but I don't think I need to do that for this plate, so I'm not going to. But if you, again, want to take it that step further, you can shellac this thing closed just to make sure that it's ready. So the last thing I will show you, and you'll see this example done in another plate, is this is the image that I'll be working on. And this marker, which does have a little bit of alcohol in it, will also most likely be reactivated when I ink this block. If you're using the lighter colors like yellow specifically or white, then these things might show up. And again, you'll want to take that step to clean your plate one time really, really thoroughly before you print, right? So after you've carved everything, this black line is going to want to print through. If you print your first ones in black, then it's no problem at all. But if you are worried about that, again, giving it a coat of shellac, a thinned out coat of shellac, you'll be able to close the whole plate off so that it won't, you'll be able to close the whole plate off so that it won't print inside of your blocks. So the last thing I have is actually just cutting your plate. So this is a linoleum plate, right? Linoleum on the front, and then it has a Hessian backing or burlap backing, but it's really Hessian. This stuff right here, that backing, if you don't cut it right, it'll start to ink up on the edges because it is fabric, right? So every time you cut this thing, it kind of cuts clean, but this stuff doesn't like to cut clean. It likes to fray, it likes to move. You can end up pulling the whole threads. You can see it on the edges there that if I pulled it, I could pull it out or it might not cut. And so for that reason, if you do need to cut your plate smaller, so I'm just gonna cut this. I'm lining up the edge with my cutting mat, but if you don't have a cutting mat, long as you have a ruler, you should be definitely okay. I'm just gonna mark it on this line one time, two time, and then usually a third time to help me keep it straight. And then I'll need my ruler. So I have a little T-square here that I'm gonna use. If you don't have a ruler, you can just use any straight edge or a piece of your cardboard backing that's on like tracing papers and things. So I have a tracing pad. I could use that if the edge is still pretty straight. I'm gonna line that up. So I'm trying to get at least 2 of the marks to keep it somewhat straight. Push this up a little bit. So pressure down. And then you're just trying to score the Hessian. So I've made it about a quarter into the plate itself. I say that it's better to go through the plate a couple of times scoring rather than trying to cut through it at once. I don't think it's a great idea, and often it ends up you cutting yourself or damaging the tools. It's just not worth it. Score it as many times as you need to cut through. Getting closer to being through, and now I'm through, right? And then we have it, let's see, we have a very clean cut, right? No frayed edges. The last thing I could do is cut that part here at a slight angle to make sure that stuff doesn't fray, but it's not really necessary. There are other ways of cutting this, so a lot of people will argue that you can just cut the front a couple of times and then snap it, and that will work, but I just like my Hessian to have a nice clean cut so it's less tempted to fray, and I would suggest it for you too, or else you have to deal with cutting it later. So my plate's cut. My plate has been prepped if I've chosen any of these prepping methods. And then we're going to be ready to carve and print.